case midway through, even if you don't explicitly say we're adding mandate 3, cut the funds from somewhere else. Noah?
I think I've had this run against me. I was debating negative against a team, and I was arguing, federalism is a disadvantage, saying that, ocean policy has traditionally been under states' jurisdiction. I had specifically correlated how their plans have traditionally been under state jurisdiction. Therefore, their plan violates principles of federalism, blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, your disadvantage could apply to pretty much any case under the topic. Therefore, it's not really a valid disadvantage because it's so generic.
Okay.
We have a specific disadvantage to our case.
That's not intrinsics. Because all they're doing there is they're saying generic disadvantages are bad. But they're not creating some kind of mandate that makes their case, that decouples their case from your disadvantage. In intrinsics, what you're doing, either explicitly or implicitly, is you're modifying your case to make the disadvantage not apply anymore. That's the difference. Yes?
Wouldn't the argument against intrinsics be, like, why didn't you guys implement this already, like an issue of funding? Like, if you knew your plan would cost X amount of money, why don't you cut it already from...
Right. That's a great negative response. Generally, the reason an affirmative team gets cornered into the area of having to bust out an intrinsic perm to beat a disadvantage is because the mandate that they're adding is extra topical. So what they were doing is in the 1 and C, they don't want to have a huge debate about extra topicality because they can't claim any advantages from extra topical mandates, right? And they don't want to risk neg getting up and saying, this mandate is extra topical, therefore the entire case falls. So what they'll do is they'll wait until the 2AC and they'll run an intrinsic permutation to modify, to create a new mandate that decouples a disadvantage. It's like a really delayed spike that's after the fact, if that makes sense. Okay, that's really complex, and none of you are ever going to use that theory anyway. But we've talked about it. Yes? Can you perm an implied counterplan? I've never heard of anyone doing that. I'm not entirely sure how it would work. It's just like, look, there's 6 options. We'll do all of them plus our case. I wouldn't recommend it. Let me put it at that. Can you perm an Ajax counterplan? Not if you're doing the middle option that the other two. No. You can't perm an Ajax.
Of the Ajax counterplan.
Yes, you could severance perm it.
Yeah.
And then you get smacked with all kinds of abuse. Yes, abuse will rain from the sky when you severance perm an Ajax counterplan. Okay. All right. We're moving on. We're moving on to my status lecture. All right?
Wait. I want to say something.
Okay, great. Yeah, you get this one, Ryan.
Okay. I remember from when I was an advanced debater, like, theory was always the coolest thing to talk about. Just like the thing that gets you most excited. But you're rarely going to use theory in your debate rounds. Like, rarely. Unless, I don't know, you ran it a lot, I guess. I rarely used it, okay?
He won nationals, by the way.
Understand in the context that theory is only going to be useful in the rounds where it's pretty much all about theory.
Yes.
So
Yes.
Just understand the purpose of theory, and that it's not just cool to just like spend tons of time talking about severance perms and intrinsics perms, but understand that it has a practical application and be looking for that.
Ryan raised a great point, and that is all theory is nothing more than common sense applied to debate through the triple lens of reality, ground, and education. And you know what? Don't even worry about education. That was always one of my favorite impacts, and nobody ever cared. So think about reality and think about fairness. If what you're doing makes sense in the real world, and if it also provides fair ground for both sides, then it's okay. If it doesn't make sense through this rubric, don't do it. All right, last thing we're going to cover under the counterplan lecture is the status. There are 3 statuses. I'm not sure what the plural of status is. I'm sorry. Stat I. There are 3 stat I that your counterplan can have in the round. The most common is the same status that an affirmative case will have, and that is unconditional. Unconditional counterplan is one that you raise in the 1 and C, and once you raise it, you are committed to defending it throughout the round. You live or die, sink or swim on the counterplan. Yes? Okay, all counterplans are not necessarily unconditional. Generally speaking, when my partner and I ran counterplans, we would also specify which status we were running. Most counterplans you'll want to run conditionally. Two reasons for that. One, it's what the judge expects. Two, it's the same burden that the affirmative team is held to. And actually, there's a third reason, and that is it builds credibility. You keep a consistent advocacy throughout the round, and that is, look, we agree status quo is bad. We just want to run this alternative that's better than what the affirmative team is doing. Unconditional is what most of your counterplans will be. Second type of status is dispositional. A dispositional counterplan is one that you advance in the 1 and C, and then you say, look, we recognize that in their next speech, the affirmative team may get up here and perm this counterplan. And if they sufficiently demonstrate that our counterplan is not competitive, then we will drop our counterplan, like any other argument, and revert back to defending the status quo in the 2NC. Why do you think you would want to do that, possibly, if you're negative? Well, that's one reason. Yes. That does happen occasionally, never in homeschool debate, but in other formats of debate. Yeah, you'll get up, neg will run an intentionally terrible counterplan that the affirmative team will perm, and then negative will sink the affirmative massive ship with all these great disadvantages that they just piled on.
I remember a college round I saw one time where the negative presented a dispositional counterplan, so the affirmative got up and permed it, and the negative ran DAs, and then the affirmative severed the counterplan that they previously permed, and so the negative reverted back to defending the counterplan that was no longer permed by the affirmative.
Yes.
Crazy.
And it can get even more complex. Like the negative then runs a new counterplan in the 2NC, and affirmative tries to perm that one, but negative winds up perming the aft case. What's going on? I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows. Don't do that. It's bad news. Your community judges are going to hate you. They're going to want to stab you with their pen.
Return to a debate tournament
Yes.
ever again.
Yes. Do not be the reason that community judges walking away thinking homeschool debaters are crazy, even though that may be true.
So, could the dispositional counterplan also be used to force the affirmative team to talk about a permutation of 1AR and waste all those 5 minutes they could have been using to talk about the negative block?
Could, but humbly I would submit to you that time-wasting arguments are foolish. You want to do is you want to win the round on your arguments, not on time wasting. The last status a counterplan can take is conditional. A conditional counterplan is one that you can drop at any point in the round. So the worst way I've ever seen this run is neg advances a counterplan in the 1NR. Then AF attacks it with massive disadvantages in the 2AC. Neg comes up and responds in the negative block and tries to keep everything together. 1AR gets up and smacks it with some more disadvantages. And by the 2NR, neg's like, oh great, we're losing the counterplan, so we drop it. And they revert back to defending the status quo, and their one argument left on the flow is a disadvantage that they ran with the counterplan in the 1NC. Generally speaking, not a great thing to do. The takeaway here is that if you run a counterplan dispositionally or conditionally, once you drop the counterplan, you revert back to defending the status quo. So any disadvantages you had that weren't contingent on the counterplan, those will still link, but all of the rest of your analysis is basically gone from the flow. Real quickly, does anybody have any ideas why conditional and dispositional counterplans might be legitimate? What do you think the theoretical basis? What's the common sense reason that makes sense? All right, yeah, that's one reason, is Congress changes things all the time. But there's a better reason. What is a counterplan at its core? It's an alternative policy stance that is a what? All counterplans can be reduced into another form of argumentation. Yes, it's a disadvantage. Have you ever had the affirmative team get up and complain when you dropped a disadvantage in the 2NC? All right. Have you ever had a rational affirmative team complain when you dropped a disadvantage in the 2NC? No. So the idea is if a counterplan is just an incredibly glorified opportunity cost disadvantage, then they should be able to drop them at any point in the round the same way that they drop other disadvantages or other arguments. But the important thing to remember is that a counterplan is really taking an advocacy. It's taking a huge position. And if you drop it, you look like you can't defend a policy, even one that you write.
How often do you think that counterplans are used as a cop-out to when someone doesn't have a brief on a case or they don't know how to argue the case
Oh,
themselves?
perfect, perfect. I like that you brought that up. In my humble opinion, in team policy debate, you should never, ever run a counterplan without evidence, unless it's a study counterplan. That's the one exception, or a uniqueness counterplan. But a uniqueness counterplan, you'll always have evidence because you're running it with a DA. The reason a study counterplan doesn't need evidence is because you're relying on the inadequacy of the affirmative team's own evidence to justify running the counterplan. Otherwise, you should have evidence. Why? Because when you run the counterplan, you inherit what from the affirmative team?
Burden of proof.
The burden of proof, yes. Meaning you have to prove that your counterplan is better than both the status quo and the affirmative team's case. And in a later lecture, we'll talk about different views on the burden of proof and presumption in counterplans. Yeah.
What about logic counterplans?
What does that even mean?
It's like a counterplan that doesn't have any evidence, just has pure logic behind it.
Well, in parley, I think that's completely okay, but not in team policy because you won't have met the burden of proof. The affirmative has all this expert testimony.
And he says, it's like, I was talking to one of my friends about this. They ran a lot of logic CPAs for their team, and they're saying, well, no, you're just too centered on evidence.
Okay,
Policy can also be about logic.
I think the best way for me to respond to this question is to say what I would do. If I was running, let's say, my national sales tax case, and you got up and you ran a counterplan with no evidence, I would smack you with an evidence standard in the 2AC that said, look, if we're going to do real policy making, we should have expert advocacy. The affirmative team, we've quoted 7 studies for you, and we have an expert by 70 Nobel laureates. As far as the negative team, they've got nothing. They have their logic. Impact, we should win on credibility alone. Impact 2, give them ones and evidence. Yeah.
I have a similar example about that. The one time that my partner and I got close to running a counterplan without evidence was against a case in Stowe last year. They dealt with genetically modified salmon things that were supposedly like these monster freak fish. But literally, this team's third justification was not enough testing done. They handed us the counterplan on the silver platter, and my partner and I got up and ran more studies on the plan without evidence. So we ended up saying in the rebuttals that any evidence they had that said that we need more testing is actually advocacy for our plan. So that was pretty cool. But that's we were walking a thin line there. It was not
Any other questions?
Actually, I remembered why they didn't read any. Oh, sorry.
All right.
I remembered why they didn't read any evidence. Because you see, in our league, you're not really taught a lot about counterplans because they're not run a lot. So all people know is they have to be non-topical and self-fully affirmative harm. So what a lot of people do is they'll read a pure logic CP and say, well, the affirmative is burden of proof, so the affirmative needs to has burden of proof to disprove our counterplan or prove that it wasn't solved.
Okay, in a later lecture, we'll talk about burden of proof and counterplans.
Okay, sweet. So disadvantages are pretty important. Like glorious. Okay, so when you're affirmative and people are running disadvantages against you that give their counterplan competitiveness, first off, address their DAs if you can, if at all possible. You should probably be prepared for the DAs that teams are going to be running against you throughout the year. Secondly, don't be afraid to present disadvantages to their counterplan. Okay, so I mean, they're going to be trying to establish that their counterplan is net beneficial, so it's in your best interest to show that it's not. And an easy way to do that is to present DAs against their counterplan. So don't be afraid to do that. And then at the end, make sure you weigh the 2 options of what you have, the affirmative team's case versus the counterplan kind of a thing. And if you're winning on the DAs, then you should be winning the round as a whole. Let's take a 2-minute break.